So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Joanna Kerr. I'm a librarian with the London Public Library, and I will be your moderator for today. Thank you for joining us for this first event in our Environmentalist in Residence series with Jennifer Chestnut. A warm welcome to Jennifer and to Emma Louie, who will meet soon. Hello. Live transcript is available if you'd like to see closed captions during our program. To enable them, click on the box in your Zoom screen, normally located at the bottom. It has the letters CC on it. There are limitations to this service. It is affected by volume and background noise, and only captions English words. Full captions will be available with the recording of this program. So I will just add that to our chat as well if you need some instructions on where to find all of that. Okay. So I'd like to start today by acknowledging for myself that as a second generation European settler whose paternal ancestors made their home on the lands of the Acadia First Nation, and as a third generation European settler whose maternal ancestors made their home on the lands of the Ardoch Algonquin First Nation, that the territory I'm speaking to you from today and the London Public Library system are located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, as well as the Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, Lenape-Wauk, and Attawandaron peoples. The Crown treaties in this territory are known as the Upper Canada Land Surrenders. These treaties continue to be living treaties. The Indigenous communities in this region include Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, Oneida Nation of the Thames, and Munsee Delaware Nation. We invite you to read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action and to reflect on acts of allyship with and actions to support Indigenous communities. The link to these calls to action is being shared in the chat. Acts to raise awareness and take personal action could also include reading books by Indigenous authors, a selection of which will be included in the follow-up email after this program, or by connecting with local Indigenous serving organizations. Thank you for reflecting on this acknowledgement and invitation to action. I'll just add that to the chat. So I am honored to be here this afternoon to listen, to share, and to learn with all of you. Today, Jennifer is in conversation with Emma Louie, and we'll also hear from Pat Donnelly with the City of London, followed by our question and answer period. It is our intention to offer a welcoming and inclusive environment for everyone. Please reflect on this as you share your thoughts and questions. And we'll be drawing prizes after each of our programs in this series for the participants of our live sessions, you people, for your choice of a composter, rain barrel, thanks to the City of London, or for a gift card to a Green Economy London business. I may be in touch with you at some point in the program to confirm your name for our draw. Thank you to our partners in this program. This program would not be possible without the support of the Houston Family Foundation, and we thank the City of London for their ongoing support and partnership in this program. So now I'll start with introducing this year's Environmentalist in Residence, Jennifer Chestnut. It's been a pleasure to work with her. So Jennifer is an environmental educator. I'm going to just go ahead and start again. Jennifer is an environmental educator and activist. She is currently studying emotional responses to environmental challenges as part of a master's program in education and sustainability, creativity, and innovation. She is a facilitator in the Work That Reconnects, a peer-led group process that supports moving through eco-despair to empowerment. A very warm welcome to Jennifer. Hello. And now I'm happy to introduce our guest, Emma Louie. Emma is an activist, a writer, a researcher, and a contributing editor with rabble.ca. She is a member of Coopérative Bibliothèque and a co-founder of the La Pêche Coalition for a Green New Deal. As a holistic health practitioner, her interests include burnout, intergenerational trauma, social justice, and collective healing. Emma was the water campaigner for the Council of Canadians for 9 years and supported water justice struggles across Northern Turtle Island. She is a contributor to the book Corporatizing Canada, Making Business Out of Public Service. She lives near Wakefield, Quebec, on Algonquin, Anishinaabe traditional territory. Welcome, Emma. We're so glad you could join us today. And lastly, we are also joined by Patrick Donnelly, our partner in the Environmentalist in Residence program. Pat is the manager of Watersheds and Climate Change for the City of London. He'll be sharing information on the Climate Emergency Action Plan at the end of our program. He will also be available to answer your questions. A very warm welcome to everyone. And now I'll hand it over to Jennifer.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joanna, for that warm welcome and creating a space for us to come together today to explore things that are in our hearts. And I just want to say that I'm both honored and humbled to be able to share the things that are in my heart and to get this opportunity to be in community with you all today. Yeah, so maybe I'll start by sharing my slideshow with everybody. So one moment. Okay, so as we, I think, all know, and I'm just sharing my screen. So the purpose of this session is to bring forth into discussion the power of social movements for the earth. And there's several reasons why I want to do this, but mainly because through my work and through my volunteering, I have seen how highlighting and being aware and having knowledge of social movements can help us feel more confident and move us into action that we want to take, whatever action that is, right? We all come with our unique skills and experience and interests and networks. So there's lots of levels in which we can take action, big and small, that are meaningful to us. So overall, though, the literature is saying, and my experience before reading this literature was really saying that being connected to social movements and also having knowledge of stories of change that are happening, people's persistence, can really build a confidence. So that idea comes from this publication, which is through Cornell University, and it's a publication about like communicating climate information and education. So I just like to start by, we're not in person together. So I just want to start by just opening up the conversation a little bit for people, as much as you like or little, it's up to you. But I'd really love to know and hear. Many of us live in the same community together. I know there are already some relationships here among us, and I thought it would be nice to start by sharing, like, what right now are our environmental interests. That could be issues that we care about, or that could be like passions that we like to do. So I invite everybody to, in the chat, to share some of your environmental interests. So for me, I mean, there's different levels, but for me right now, I'm pretty excited about spring and just being along the Thames River and watching all the birds come back. Great. Great. So I see birds gardening, walking in the woods from Susan, Joan recycling and garden. Glenn's talking about protection of habitat for all species, Jesse water, Marilyn protecting watersheds, waterways, wetlands, remaining green space. Thank you so much for your shares. These things, our desires and our love, are so important to creating the world that we want. Growing everything from flowers to food, says Julie, nice Julie. Reducing use of fossil fuels, climate crisis, spring is earlier every year, shares Wilf. Thank you, Wilf, for your observation, a disturbing observation for so many of us. Roy is sharing, oh, thanks, Roy. Thanks very much for your kindness, your support. Carbon targets, animal extinction, water, protecting of lands from Lorraine, capitalist devastation. In Hamilton, welcome folks from Hamilton, awesome. In Hamilton, concerned about our waterfront and our creek. In London, we have similar concerns around water. Protection of woodland. Okay, thank you so much. Feel welcome to continue to share if there was something else you wanted to say there. So yeah, already, I see solidarity, I see commonality among us. We live in different places, but we all live in this time, right? That is a challenging time and also a meaningful time. Very excited to do this presentation, but I have to say, I get a little tech phobic, so bear with me, friends. Just getting to the next screen and my keyboard is doing a little funny dance. Okay, so yeah, and I'll just add to that list. My interests over the past 10 years really have been around, as Joanna said, thank you for that warm welcome, around environmental education and studying like our inner responses to what's going on in activism. And so I just want to speak to for a moment a little bit what brings me to present on social movements, and also the particular social movement of the rights to nature. That may be a movement that some folks here we know about, and we may be hearing it for the first time, as it is kind of emerging in culture as a legal practice. So yeah, so first of all, yeah, I've been working with young people doing specifically environmental education for about the past decade. And you know, it's such an honor and a joy to work with young people as they come into the world and are like curious, and to help create spaces to build nature connection. But young people are also very concerned about their world, and they know things. But of course, you know, we wouldn't necessarily go into deep details as adults as we would with young people, but still there is a lot of concern there. And so I do introduce key issues with them, and especially track what they are interested in and what they want to discuss and feel ready to discuss. So what I've noticed through that, I've been studying and watching for this decade, and I think I've gotten better at it. And what I've noticed is that with young people, one of the major strengths for them to enjoy that education, to feel empowered, and to help build a relationship with nature, which is a key goal, is maybe not just for young people, but all of us, is bringing in stories of change. And I also learned that even deeper through the opportunity to co-facilitate a course on the climate crisis for high school teachers with my partner, where I saw how important it is to tell stories from civil society, so people know that when we take action, we are part of a broader movement, and there are people working on the solutions. So often our environmental education comes from the news a lot of the time, right? And we know that it isn't common, it's not common practice in the news to tell the solutions that come after, the resiliency. And so those stories are so important. And then in the past couple of years, the last 2 years, I had the opportunity to write a thesis, and I've been exploring these emotional responses to climate change, as Joanna was saying. And with that, in the research, I also came across the fact that different researchers from different places are saying that our sense of efficacy and our sense of collective efficacy, which comes from social engagement and also hearing the stories of change, means so much to our ability to look at the information, to act, and also have well-being. So that's really my intention today with that. Finally, I'll just say, starting in 2011, I had some opportunity that really changed my life and brought great meaning. And that was been working with the Activist Network in London, and a network called the Council of Canadians, where we have a strong London chapter here. And so I started doing activism there. So I started feeling the collective inspiration of working with people. And yeah, it was just such a meaningful time. And I know some of those friends are with us here today. So I just want to share this photo. So from those days, the specific role that I was taking, this network does a lot working on climate and water and all sorts of stuff, but I am really passionate about explaining the danger of trade agreements and their corporate structures, where corporations are enabled through trade courts to sue nations if they are not able to profit in the way by running their businesses because local bylaws or national legislation or government decision says that business is not a good fit. And unfortunately, in the new trade agreements since NAFTA, it's very common practice that corporations can sue for that. And there isn't a recourse in trade agreements for countries or citizens or just communities and families to push back on that. So yeah, that was my interest. And so, of course, that's pretty dark material, but we still had a lot of fun and we worked on building community. Well, we didn't work so much. We hung out and we had little parties and then we worked and we planned a lot of events and we ran about close to maybe 50 events in London on this. And here we're celebrating because we lobbied at City Hall. We worked with City Hall and City Hall agreed kind of against precedent that that they would request an exemption from this particular agreement that's dangerous to democracy, CETA, for the City of London to request and join with other cities, about 40 across the country or 50, to not be part of this trade agreement. So when those moments come, we got to celebrate. So those are some of the folks that really inspire me. Just being in community and doing the work of change is very meaningful, inspiring. I'd like to put it back out to you in these times and your projects and your passions. Who's inspiring you these days? I welcome you to share in the chat. And let's just remember that the environmental movement is broad. It's a big tent, right? So some of us are working on gardening, some of us are working on protests like I shared or other things. But yeah, it could be anyone that inspires you. Let's bring that energy into this space. We all need inspiration in these times. Thank you, Lorraine. Indigenous land defenders, Greta Thunberg, absolutely Joanna Macy, Seth Klein. By all the people working towards a better, greener planet, especially young people. Thank you, Susan. Sephora Berman, Doug Talami, author of Nature's Best Hope. Thank you, Joan. Abby Lewis, Naomi Klein, School Strikes. Yes, yes. When we look at issues, it's just so important that we bring in the people doing this work, because we're always like in counterbalance, right, to a media that, you know, some journalists are just working very hard and trying to get those good stories out, but we often, in a response to media, end up feeling like, well, where are the people? Why aren't we moving, right? So it can be very helpful, I think, to share those stories. Senator Murray Sinclair, Robin Wall, Kimmer, Perform Gravel Mining Coalition. Thank you, Catherine. Isaac Murdoch, Maud Barlow. I'm inspired by my mom. Me too, Jessie. Thank you. Okay. All right. Indigenous artists. Thank you so much, everybody. Welcome to add more. If you wanted to say more into the chat. All right. So because we are talking about social movements, and I'm lucky enough for my job to be able to be looking at social movements and environmental change, I want to share a few stories with you today before we get into our main topic, which is the rights of nature. And now I see that my keyboard is being funny, and when I press the arrow, it's doing the same thing. So just
sometimes, Jennifer, with the mouse, you can click it right onto the slide on the screen. Sometimes that can work too.
Oh, thank you so much.
No worries.
Tech anxiety. Okay, here we go. That works. Okay, so first story comes from India. You may know these stories, or they might be new to you, but Jadav Payang in 1979 noticed that his beloved island, Majuli Island on the Brahmaputra River in and around India was eroding, and quite quickly. And he was becoming concerned of species there who were dying, and he was becoming concerned for the island itself. And so Jadav said he wanted to plant trees. He got involved in a little project planting trees, but that project ended, and he continued to plant trees, and he continues to plant trees to this day. He's helped seed a forest that is now home to like migrating elephants who come every year to breed there, to endangered and critical species like rhino. And yeah, the forest that he helped seed is larger than Central Park. So yeah, I just like to notice how these stories make me feel. So let's let these stories land. Julia Butterfly Hill, in the late 90s, she became concerned as a young person in her 20s of trees and forests, and she visited the California redwoods for the first time, and she fell in love, as many of us do when we visit these special places and get to know a special tree. And she became friends with some people who were working to protect the forest. And they were going up onto a small platform, maybe 6 foot by 4 foot, I think, very small, in this very old redwood that they named Luna. They were taking turns because this area was being logged, and they wanted to put themselves, they felt so compelled, they wanted to put themselves on the line for not just this tree, but what this tree means and represents. And so Julia did that. And one of those days she didn't come down, and she didn't come down for 738 days. And she lived in Luna through the winter storm. She lived through some harassment from a couple individuals logging. And during that time, she took many interviews, and the world became more aware of trees and that we have a role to play in their protection. So thanks to Julia Hill. Wangari Maathai. We might know Wangari from the Nobel Peace Prize that she won. So I'm just trying to get that red line off. I don't know how it appeared. But we'll just go back from the Nobel Peace Prize. And Wangari was a very outspoken leader and wise person in her community in Kenya. And people often sought her counsel, and especially women, because she didn't let herself be restricted by the roles and imprisonment that were put on women's lives, culturally speaking, how they were encouraged not to speak up. And so Wangari just resisted that, and a lot of women were drawn to that, and they came to her with their problems. And a lot of women at that time were dealing with poverty and like lack of access to even enough food to feed their families, medicine for their families, even simple things like firewood for preparing their meals. And so Wangari started sharing ideas with them about native trees and how which trees could be used for the medicine, which trees had the most nourishment for food, etc. And so women started joining together and supporting each other, and they built a whole network across Kenya. And over a few decades, they planted over 50 million trees. And that's the Green Belt movement. And this Green Belt movement has gone on to inspire other movements. Josephine Mandamin, closer to home. And I know some people here hosted Josephine Mandamin a few years ago. And Josephine Mandamin was a Anishinaabe, and she, in her tradition, women are the protectors of water. And so as an elder, she started really pondering water and the future of water in these times. And she decided she needed to do something. And what she decided to do was begin walking around the Great Lakes. And so she talked with her community, and her friends and others joined her, and they formed a group of water walkers. And they walked around the Great Lakes over a series of springs. So from 2003 to 2017, it is said that Josephine walked over 25,000 kilometers. And through this, she drew attention to, the real threats to the Great Lakes, and also the great sacredness of water. Last story that I want to share today is also in Canada, or Northern Turtle Island. And that is just kind of a story paying homage to so many people out on the West Coast who are defending the last old growth forests, and who are defending the water and the rivers and the land, and often really putting themselves on the line, being thrown in jail for simply standing up for their right and their community's right to protect their land and their history and their heritage. And so this story is the tiny house warriors, the Shuswap people, and one of the ways that they've responded to the Trans Mountain Pipeline going through their unceded territory without their approval is to build tiny houses and to situate these houses along the pipeline, where the pipeline direction, in resistance and as witness. So yeah, I wonder how those stories land for you. I hope that they give you some strength and inspiration, but there are so many stories out there, right? So the telling of stories is important at this time. And with these stories, I think they kind of beckon a broader frame, a broader concept of like, wow, okay, we don't always see it, but there's a lot of movement for change happening. There's definitely millions of people around the world who really care and are committed, and we're making changes in our personal lives or in our communities. And one concept that has been given to this, one name that has been given to this that I find helpful is the Great Turning. And this concept has been in use since the 1980s. Different people speak about it, David Korten, Joanna Macy, etc. And it's just this idea that we are, yes, there are great problems that we face and complex problems, but there is also movement for change happening. So throughout this series, I'll present just some concepts that I've been lucky to learn from other people that I have found empowering. And they might be empowering for you, but of course we all have sovereign conceptual thinking. And so if it resonates, then please use it. If it doesn't, then as my first teacher in the healing arts, Phyllis Lodge, used to say to us at our workshops, if it doesn't resonate, you can just leave it in the room. So I guess you could just leave it in the Zoom room if it doesn't resonate. But my intention is to share these concepts that have been empowering for me to be part of change. And along with this concept of great turning, further, trying to work on that little red line again, I guess it's going to stay. Okay. So is this perspective of the different levels that we work on when we make change. And I want to really open up a wide lens on that because we all are drawn in different ways. So three perspectives on, or dimensions on, making change that comes from the work of Joanna Macy is the idea that, there's resisting or activism, there is building, like creative projects and creating actual structural change, and then there's also imagining or rethinking things. So we've been looking at a bunch of stories around resisting or slowing down destruction in ways. So many ways to build. So Jada Payang helping to seed forest, but these happen all the time. And in our community, we're so lucky to have Reimagine Co., some visionary and determined folks who've opened a waste-free store for us in London, or people starting organizations like Nautical Waters was created by a young woman in our community to upcycle ghost gear from the ocean so fish and species are more protected. But I think through all of this, something that's important to keep in mind that might feel kind of contrast in the times that we're living in the time of escalating war, in the time of pandemic and climate change, is that it's important to dare to dream. It's important to dare to dream. And the thing is, no matter the outcomes of different events, we have some successes and we have losses. But no one can take our imaginative capacity and no one can prevent us from envisioning the world that we want. And that's a very important ingredient. And maybe this is one of the special gifts that humans as a species have to offer at this time, our imaginations and our courage to dream. So we can imagine or create these shifts in consciousness, as Joanna Macy says, in different ways. If we're so called, the arts can be really helpful, just reading or watching the films or different things. Another one I'd like to put forward from my practice and my teachers is mindfulness. And because it's often not talked about, I find so much about shifting in consciousness, especially consciousness to a more eco-centric consciousness, maybe an ecological consciousness that is more healthy for the world and the state of our planet. Especially, I don't hear this a lot in settler circles, and I am a settler. I just want to mention one brief practice that has been very helpful for me in a tradition. This comes from the tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist monk from Plum Village. And I really like their traditions because as a settler, I just am aware I don't want to appropriate. I want to do things that are meaningful, but do not take from Indigenous culture, especially with all the history of Canada and my ancestors. So their tradition has been really helpful to me. So for example, they teach how we can use just kind of our daily life to help shift to eco-consciousness with simple practices. So like sitting here, talking a lot. So if I just take a moment to breathe. I invite you, if you're having a busy day, you just want to rest, let's just take a moment. But as I breathe in and I notice the oxygen filling my body. As I breathe out, I'm grateful for the oxygen in my body. And as I breathe in, I remember the trees outside my home making oxygen. And as I breathe out, I'm grateful to those trees. So just a thought that I wanted to share. But today's session is really about the rights of nature movement. And so, which is appropriate, I think, to come after cultivating eco-consciousness. So the rights of nature movement is really a movement that it's now a global movement that goal is to create legal standing for nature and ecosystems to protect and create the world that we want. And GARN is one of the major organizations doing that work and bringing people together. And I won't take very long on this, but just to say that I come to this from the trade justice lens that I was discussing earlier, seeing that corporations have legal rights that are expanded to a level that is not necessary, not practical, and not healthy. So I think that the rights of nature is a good counter. It's good, in my opinion, for many reasons, but it's a good counter and a necessary counter to trade agreements. Maybe I'll just give one of these examples about what I'm talking about for those that are not aware with trade agreements. So yeah, let's go to Ethel versus Canada. So this was one of the first court cases against Canada under NAFTA. Ethel is a gasoline corporation from the States, and Canada just decided that in the 90s that they didn't want their products because there was research out there from the States that said there was a neurotoxin in their gasoline as an additive. And so when Ethel found that out, that they weren't going to do business with Canada, even though they had a trade agreement, Ethel sued our nation. And they won through the trade courts because that's how the trade courts are set up. They're a one-way court, transnational corporation, like the ones with a lot of money. If you don't have a lot of money, you can't run these courts. So the very big ones suing, and Canada paid out $13 million to them and took back the ban and rescinded the ban and accepted the product. And there's lots of cases like this. Luckily, there is some good news in the NAFTA 2, the new version, through activism, through activists working across the country hard, and other people bringing awareness to this. The courts for Canada and the States, anyway, were taken away, but it's still a major problem because this is woven into how trade agreements work, and Canada is involved in lots of trade agreements. So when we talk about the rights of nature, I think in the Canadian context, it's very appropriate to talk about New Zealand. because New Zealand has a history of treaty violations and great repression. So for New Zealand, this river has become kind of worldwide famous, the Wanganui River, the river that Maori people have been making their community, their culture, their home on for centuries. The Maori have resisted very strong to government action and repression of the river's rights and their rights. And so New Zealand through time did create a tribunal where the government was responding to and beginning to apologize for past behavior. And the government finally decided to rectify some great treaty violations. In 2011, they decided to change the legal standing of the river to give it legal personhood. And so that was a first step, a good celebration. And then by 2017, legislation in the country was passed for the Wanganui River to have rights of personhood. Okay, so I want to share with you a video, and I'm just aware of the time, so maybe I'll just share part of it. But this, I was going to share a longer clip, I'll share a shorter clip. But this video is on YouTube and it's freely shared, and it's called The Rights of Nature. And so let's share that and we'll watch it for a few minutes. I think it sets up the movement well.
Our minuscule brain cannot perceive what is the might and sophistication of nature. Yet, without me needing to understand everything, the world exists. The land is not real estate. You own real estate. That there is land and nature, and nobody owns that. This idea of time, my brain can stretch back 30 years, the land's millions, and I get to be connected to that.
Since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, humans have viewed nature as a resource from which to extract commodities: fish, energy, minerals, timber. Nature is also seen as a place to dispose of waste, often without considering the impacts it may have on the human condition, whose lives depend on a healthy ecosystem. Today, these environmental challenges continue, but a new idea, pulled from ancient indigenous practice, may provide the earth with a rights-based solution.
You are the child, and that land out there, that earth mother of yours, is your parent. No human owns your mother.
Okay. So this video is actually really great. And as it continues, it goes on to share a whole bunch of different cases. And we'll just look briefly at some of those cases of giving Earth legal standing, but it gives a really good global picture. And I think Joanna is going to share it in the chat, the link at some point in our conversation. So I'm just going to the chat because I notice. Oh, awesome. Great. Joanna already shared it. Perfect. Okay. Okay. So I just want to review a little bit more of the movement, and then we're going to hear from Emma. So, okay. So as we've been learning and discussing, the New Zealand was a great leader in this. Is it? Yeah. In the 2010s, so in 2017, New Zealand, through really the leadership of the Maori, gave the Wanganui River legal standing. Can everybody hear me okay? Is the tech okay? Can someone give me a little wave?
Sounds great, Jennifer.
Oh, thank you so much. Okay. Tech anxiety. Okay, I'm good. All right. So, but they also went on to move an ecosystem from a crown corporation to surrender that to just be an ecosystem with rights on its own that citizens could then take to court if those rights are deeply violated and it's unsafe and unprotected for future people. And also they did that with a mountain. Further, the video goes on to show that in 2008, Ecuador was the first country to rewrite its constitution with the rights of Mother Earth in it. And Bolivia followed suit in 2009. And then in 2010, folks around the world who were looking at the COP conferences, the climate conferences discussing solutions were really disheartened, as many folks still are, but they were really disheartened in 2009. They're like, okay, well, that's not the correct vision. That's not enough. We need to actually prepare for the world that we want, and we need to work faster. So they brought in the rights of nature paradigm, and 32,000 people gathered. And then this draft was created of a new declaration. This is a proposed declaration. It's still proposed, and the UN is discussing it. It's called the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth, and it's meant as a companion declaration to the rights of Indigenous people, to the right to the 1948 human rights document itself, and many others. So we can see Desmond Tutu here and different people really backing the importance of this. And then just to say, because it hasn't come up yet, and I think it's also important for knowledge for many of us where we sit and where we live, that this movement has moved also into the area of municipal action. So in the States, for example, there has been a strong movement through the support of the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, which is lawyers doing this good work of changing the legal paradigm. Over 40 cities and towns, from like Pittsburgh to Santa Monica to little tiny towns, also in different jurisdictions, some being Republican, some being Democrat, but they're passing rights of nature legislation. Sometimes it gets shot down by the courts later, but sometimes the courts back it. And it's still a battle, but they are passing this legislation for protection. So maybe the most local example to us is across Lake Erie in Toledo, Ohio. If you remember back, Toledo faced, well, they face algae blooms in general for their drinking water. And they got together, and the citizens just wrote legislation. They heard about this rights of movement thing, and they got help with the CELDF, and their town of Toledo, their city of Toledo, voted to implement these rights. Unfortunately, in 2020, the federal court struck it down, but other people are still doing this. Like there was an assemblyman in New York who's writing a Lake Erie Bill of Rights. He just shared it in March 2022, last month. So yeah, my thoughts are, you know, if rights for large transnational corporations, why not rights for Mother Earth? I think we'll leave it there, and I'm really excited to hear from Emma and Emma's experience in this work for a decade and probably more than that. So Emma, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Hi, everyone. I'm Emma. Thanks so much, Jennifer, for that really inspiring talk. It's so great to hear like all the amazing things that people are doing and all the stories. And I just want to say thanks to you and the London Public Library for inviting me to be part of this series. Appreciate the introduction earlier, Joanna, and it's really nice to speak alongside of you, Patrick, as well. I see a bunch of familiar names and faces on here from the London chapter and of the Council of Canadians and other chapters as well. So it's just so nice to be in this space with you all and everyone else. So World Water Day was March 22nd, a couple weeks ago, and then Earth Day coming up. So it's just very timely to be talking about water. I understand Huron College became a blue community on World Water Day, which is really exciting to hear. I know that the London chapter played a role also in London becoming a blue community last year. So happy 1-year anniversary for that. So I'll just touch on some of the ongoing threats to water that some of you probably already know about, but bottled water is an issue. There's gravel pit mining in Tiny Township, which is just a few hours away from London, and then oil and gas projects like fracking, tar sands, pipelines. They continue to pose a threat to water and watersheds and people's drinking water. And then we continue to see the climate crisis play out, whether that's with drought or flooding or forest fires, but all of this has an impact on water security and safe, clean drinking water. In March, mid-March, there was Indigenous nations and individuals were able to begin applying for compensation under the new claims process related to the drinking water advisories in First Nation reserves. Some of you may know there was a class action lawsuit that was settled with the federal government last year for $8 billion for harm caused by the ongoing drinking water advisories. And some of you know the drinking water advisories went on for decades in some of these communities and nations. And as part of the class action lawsuit settlement, the federal government is to repeal the Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Act they actually were supposed to by the end of March. And then they are supposed to develop replacement legislation in consultation with First Nations by the end of this year. But a lot of First Nations are calling for First Nations led legislation and also some calls about how water can be protected in these communities without leadership from these Indigenous nations. And Jennifer mentioned the militarized responses to a lot of land and water defenders, like the tiny house warriors she mentioned, but also land and water defenders who are protecting the Witsinqua, the Morris River in BC. And just want to focus more today on I guess riffing off of what Jennifer was talking about, like solutions that really are coming from Indigenous folks. And during my time with the Council of Canadians, we supported many Indigenous and frontline struggles to protect water. And I think it's all the more important to uplift and uphold Indigenous water laws, and I think it's key to protecting water for future generations. And we really see a contrast in Canadian law or settler laws and how they really center allowing projects to go forward that are quite harmful for water. I know there's a lot of great work done in some of these government spaces where people are fighting against that. But when we look at Indigenous water laws, we really see they're underpinned by the idea that water is sacred, and that water is that we're a part of water, and that water is a part of us. So I just want to go through some examples that I've been looking at. I wrote an article for Rabble for World Water Day, so there are a bunch of links in this article. I can share it in the chat after. There's some really amazing projects that are happening. There's one called the Decolonizing Water Project, and it's out of out of British Columbia, but I think there's other folks in other areas who are working on this, but it's a collective of Indigenous and settler scientists, legal theorists, community members, researchers, and students. And their goal is really to create Indigenous-led community-based water monitoring initiatives and really have it be a model for Indigenous water governance. Like if we were to shift the water governance structures and policies that we see now, and we were to shift them to center around Indigenous water laws and so forth, what would that look like? And so this project provides a really concrete example of that. There's also related to this a water gathering at Manitou Api and Bannock Point in May. So if you're interested in joining that, it's May 26th to the 29th. And I'll share the link to this in the chat after. And there's been some really amazing and inspiring water declarations put together by a number of Indigenous groups and allies. One in the last few years has been Treaty 3's Navy Declaration, and it just really recognizes that water has spirit, that it's sacred, and that it unites us. And it's just some really powerful principles for Western governments and schools and other organizations and institutions to look at. And they also have a toolkit. It allows you to look at how you can implement it in your community. There's some other water declarations like the Secwepemc Sacred Water Declaration, the KI Watershed Declaration, which was, I think, passed more than a decade ago, the Fraser Declaration. And then there's also, some of you might know West Coast Environmental Law, a legal organization based in the West Coast, and they have this program called RELAW, which is Revitalizing Indigenous Law for Land, Air, and Water, and it looks at revitalizing Indigenous laws and legal traditions. So just some really great work that's already happening that I think we can really draw from. So I just want to touch on then the example of the Magpie River. So Jennifer talked about the Wangari River, and so there is also a river that was attributed legal personhood. I think it was last year sometime. It's the Magpie River in Quebec, and it's the first river in Canada to be recognized with legal personhood. It's a river that's significant to the Innu of Equanchit. I don't know if that's the right way to pronounce it, but it's fairly significant for us here in Canada, and I think a model for us to look at. And that river has, I believe, one dam on it, and there was concern that there would be more dams put on the river, and so the Innu worked with environmental organizations and the local government to have the river recognized as a legal person. And alongside that, or I guess the crux of that, was that the river was granted 9 legal rights. And I'm just going to read them because I think it's really important and powerful to think about what rights we would attribute to waterways, to lakes and rivers, and so forth. So the first right is the right to flow. And I'll just go through the list. The right to respect for its cycles, the right for its natural evolution to be protected and preserved, the right to maintain its natural biodiversity, the right to fulfill its essential functions within its ecosystem, the right to maintain its integrity, the right to be safe from pollution, the right to regenerate and be restored, and then finally the right to sue. So it's just really like powerful and beautiful rights to recognize for water. And as I mentioned before, I had done work in terms of supporting Indigenous folks, and I know a lot of chapters that I work with have done the same. And the more that I do work, when I left the council, I also worked for, I worked more locally. And so I worked with a group in Ottawa who was looking at the privatization of water through bottled water. And then I'm working with a cooperative where I live now. And then just thinking about how we protect water locally. And I don't see any other way than to recognize Indigenous water rights and law. And I think that that's a key part of it. And also just that being a part of the need to think about decolonization and to think about the relationship that we have and then how we go about changing that and shifting that. And I think the rights of nature is a really powerful way to do that. And then I think about how the cooperative that I'm a part of called Biblioterre, we're thinking about what are the ways in which we can recognize what's the colonization that's happened on the land, and then what are the ways in which we can think about land sharing or land trusts in support of the land back movement, and then what role, like how do we change our relationship to water alongside of that. So I think about even in our community, what are the ways in which we can recognize right of water, and then also just thinking about, like, all of us to think about, like, how can we make this happen in our communities, and what if rights were given to the Thames River in London, or I know there's people joining from different places, but what if we were to think about attributing rights in that way to the watersheds in your communities? So I will end it there. I'm really eager to have a conversation with you all about this. So I'm going to pass it back to Jennifer.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Emma, for all your experience and for this deeper decolonization lens that we really need. Yeah, I'll just share maybe one or two more images about this concept of, like, that Emma proposes, like, what if our communities, what would it be like if our communities pass legislation to protect our local water bodies? So, and then after that, we're going to have one announcement. We have several announcements to kind of sprinkle through the talk. Most of them won't be at the end, but we have an announcement that, really relates to our conversation today. So we'll hear from Pat, and then we're going to open up to Q&A. So let's take a look and think a little bit deeper of this concept of what if, and what could that look like and how could that happen? Just a moment. So actually, in the process of preparing for this presentation, I learned that, in fact, there has been conversation around the Thames River. I saw earlier in the chat, Brian Smith, who's done a lot in our community to protect the Thames River, was, sharing in the chat that the Thames River could really use some protection. And I know, Brian, you know that really well from the work and the protection that you did do for us with the Thames River. And so, yeah, there has been some conversation. A committee was formed in 2011 and still meets, I hear. It's called the Thames River Clearwater Revival. And it's really just like a partnership approach with First Nations in collaboration with conservation authorities, government at each level. And eventually, I think this conversation is going to be brought open to the broader community. And one of the suggestions I hear from that is being discussed with this group is that it could be time to give the Thames River legal standing and protection of rights of personhood. So I know actually Pat Donnelly, who was introduced earlier, is with us here today as the City of London manager in charge of watersheds and climate change. And I know Pat works with this group. So if anybody has questions, that Pat may be able to speak to that. I know there's just still really in discussion, but Pat is here. So thank you so much to Pat, and thank you for sharing this news with me. And also, before we open up to Q&A, I think it's pretty important because we have a very important piece of legislation coming to City Council around climate change. So before we open up to Q&A and discussion, I'm going to turn it over to Pat, and he's going to talk about the London Climate Emergency Action Plan, and then we'll open to Q&A. Okay, over to you, Pat.
Great, thanks very much, Jennifer. Yeah, and thanks for that little introduction about this announcement. Before I jump into the discussion about the Climate Emergency Action Plan that we're doing in London, I'll just mention for those people that are familiar with London, those folks in Peterborough and Hamilton may not know the scene behind me, but this is the North Thames River taken from the shoreline right by the University Bridge. And as I was taking this photograph, we had fly fishermen who were standing in the middle of the river fishing. And it's one of my favorite spots just because of the environment around it. The Thames Valley Trail is also right beside it, as well as the multi-use trail. So just that's a little bit of the setting. My job, as Jennifer has mentioned, I'm the manager of Watersheds and Climate Change. And I've been involved in the discussion about watersheds, river management, most of my career, not only in London, also in other parts of Ontario and in Canada. So I come from a perspective of rivers and watersheds. When I drive across the countryside, I look at the dips and valleys and try and figure out which drainage area that surface water is going to. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of the biases or the lens that I look at things through. When we talk about eco-justice, it's not a term that I'm all that familiar with. However, the words and the descriptions that Jennifer has given, especially the one on a shift of consciousness, I think when we talk about climate change, that's really what we're talking about, is a shift in consciousness, the behavior change that is needed in order to move us in the right direction. And in 2019, the City of London Council declared a climate emergency. And we are one of around 520 municipalities who have declared a climate emergency. And one can argue, what is it that a municipality, small individual actions could do to make an impact on climate change? And certainly it's everybody's actions that will have an impact on climate change. So that's the behavior aspect of it. In London, we've set 3 goals for our climate emergency action plan, and it is getting to net zero by 2050. And that is certainly a common claim that you will hear now, with the federal government actually increasing their time frame for reducing their greenhouse gases. We're also looking at provincial legislation doing that as well. And certainly municipalities, who are where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, has a major role in that. Making London more resilient is recognizing the fact that the climate is changing and we need to be ready for it. The scene behind me will become more flooded more frequently and probably more extreme in the future. And we're already starting to see those changes in our flooding and our river. Bringing everyone along is really intended to identify that we have vulnerable populations that will be impacted by climate change much more than many people on this call and many people that are in the population of the City of London. Those are folks that are disadvantaged economically, perhaps physically, their health, seniors, obviously youngsters. So these are the vulnerable populations that will be impacted the most by climate change, and we need to reflect that in the work that we're doing. I think the COVID pandemic has really identified that even further and put more emphasis on it. So if I want to encourage you to learn more about the City of London's Climate Emergency Action Plan, I'm going to ask you to go to a website, which is called getinvolvedlondon.ca. and the /climate. Now we'll put that in the chat. That is where all the information that we've accumulated over the past 3 years is put together. And I realize that everyone's tired of looking at screens and perhaps going to websites, but I'll just mention we have videos, 2-minute, 4-minute, 5-minute videos, which really give you a feel as to what it is that we're trying to accomplish here in London. Also an idea of the goals that we're trying to do, and also to make sure people realize this is a community plan. This is something that the city and the municipal structure can only do so much. It's individual behaviors and the actions that you take. And I'll put a plug in for our next webinar where I'll be involved in and speaking on the idea of actions. In our plan, we've identified what we're calling 10 example households. And what are the actions of those 10 households, going from an individual family with 3 kids and 3 cars and their single family home to a single mother living in an apartment and relying on transit. So different households, what can they do to contribute their share to reducing greenhouse gases and also to become more resilient and being ready for the emergencies that we will see in the future with our extreme weather, which is definitely going to be wetter, warmer, and wilder, I think, are the 3 terms that many municipalities across Ontario have been using that term after Durham Region put that term in their first plan. So behavior change is very much a focus of what we're talking about. I'll just mention the plan itself. When you go to the Get Involved London .ca website, the plan is about 60 pages, and I think people need to know that because people don't want to sit and read and necessarily a lot of information. The work plans that are attached to it, and there are 10 of them, cover what is being proposed with regards to immediate timelines, medium timelines, and longer term timelines. And those cover transportation, they cover household actions, they cover the whole idea of communication and how do we engage with people, especially those vulnerable populations. So I think you'll find that of interest. One of the work plans is implementing natural climate solutions, which I believe is what we're talking, a major focus of what we're talking about here. We are the forest city. If we can't protect and enhance our forest cover and our trees, which absorb carbon dioxide, then we're not doing a very good job. And that will be a major component of enhancing the urban forest strategy that has been designed in the city. So I think the people on this call, even those from Hamilton and Peterborough, we have many conversations with your counterparts in your municipalities, just because this is a common theme all the way across Southern Ontario. We are focused on all aspects that will help us get to those 3 goals. The other thing I'll mention is the work plans are supported by background documents, and there's 13 of those. And those background documents do talk about what the future climate will look like in London. So, what are the number of increased hot days? What's the increase in precipitation that we can expect? And with that information, we can start making decisions on how we adapt. So there's frequently asked questions, videos I mentioned. One I'll just highlight for those people that have trouble trying to figure out what's a ton of carbon dioxide look like. We have a website, a video called Trouble with Bubbles. And I will give credit to where it came from. It was the city of New York that did it first. And basically it's the size of these bubbles taking over the city and showing that after 1 second, 1 minute, 1 day, 1 month, 1 year, what carbon dioxide looks like being created by our municipality. So I'll invite you to take a look at that. I think you'll find that quite intriguing. And again, it's on the website called Trouble with Bubbles. Other than that, I think the only other thing that I would mention when we talk about eco-justice, and I think someone in the chat has already mentioned it, we have responsibilities at a municipal level, at a provincial level, and at a federal level. And we just happen to have a provincial election coming up. We also have a municipal election coming up. And these are fairly significant tick points with regards to the discussion on climate change, because we need that leadership, we need that direction And certainly that is something that an activist crowd can take advantage of and look to that with regards to what is it that we can do to make sure that we have the leaders. So my last point, which I have to give a little discussion to, is right now this is a draft plan. We are going to our council, and the first step in that is going to a committee of council called the Strategic Priorities and Policy Committee, and that goes on April 5th, so that's this Tuesday. So for those people that are interested in actually watching to see how that is playing out in the discussion at the committee level and a public participation meeting that is part of it, I'll invite you to go to the again, the city's website. There's an area called Council and Committee Meetings, and I can put that in the chat as well before we end our call today. If you're wanting to speak at that meeting, you do have to register in advance. There is an email address, which is sppc@london.ca. Again, I'll put that in the chat box. If you're wishing to speak, you do have to register, and don't wait till Tuesday to do it. You need to do it Monday late in the day at the latest. Other than that, you can watch it live stream. There is a limited seating, so if you do want to go to City Hall and see it, you can do that as well. But that is something that is a major step in the discussion about this plan. And so far, most of the comments that we've received on the draft plan, which has been available for public input for the last 2 months actively, but before that, we've had many different opportunities for feedback. Most people are saying, get going. Get it finished and get moving. So I think it'll be an interesting conversation at our standing committee meeting on Tuesday, and it'll be interesting to see whether it is actually approved at that point in time, or whether there are some adjustments that our councillors are wanting to make based on the feedback that we've already heard. So that is more or less what I wanted to provide and to share, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions specifically on this, or also on the Clearwater revival slide that Jennifer had up earlier. So thanks, Jennifer.
Awesome. Thank you so much for Pat and giving us kind of the inside scoop at the City Hall level around the community, the Climate Emergency Action Plan. And sounds like that would be an important event if we're wondering of who to vote for in the fall, what people's positions are around climate on Tuesday. That would be a good event to attend to. So thank you. Okay, let's open up for discussion, for questions, actually. Any questions? We have about 15 minutes left. So, we have a good maybe 12 minutes just to answer some questions. I know some questions have come through the chat. I'm wondering, Joanna, if you would like to read those questions, if we could start that way.
Sure, no problem.
Great, thank you.
All right. So I'll go to the first one I'm seeing here, but I may get them out of order, but I will include them. So I'll start with this one here. How do we advocate for the inclusion of rights of nature into current water management plans in Ontario?
Yeah, that's a great question. How do we advocate for rights of nature into current water plans? I wonder, Emma, it's hard because we're not in real-time space, but Emma, this brings to mind what you were sharing about our role, and also I think some rising consciousness around decolonization and centering that. Did you want to speak to that one?
Sure, I can try. I don't know currently where the discussions are around water management plans, but I have two thoughts around that. And to me, taking a two-pronged approach is important in that when there are times and spaces to give comment around these plans. Sorry, there's a little bit of background noise. That it's important to raise these issues for the purpose of spreading awareness and for people to understand what rights of nature is and what it looks like and where it's happening around the world. But I also think too, I don't have a lot of faith in in the Ontario government. It's also a colonial government. And so I think alongside of that, we need to be thinking about solutions in our communities. And so, but it's not to say that speaking out in those spaces isn't important. So taking, I think, both of those approaches, and I think that's the approach that some activists do take, is that it's important to what Jennifer was talking about, resisting, but also the building. And so thinking about our different roles in social justice and I guess, yeah, having different approaches, but then thinking about, like, if we were to recognize and uplift Indigenous laws, then ideal if that's recognized in the existing laws, but that's not always going to happen. And so what are the ways in which we can uplift Indigenous laws without necessarily relying on a government, a colonial government that might not necessarily do that? And so some of the resources that I had mentioned, like West Coast Environmental Law, they have some really great resources and have done some great work around that. And also the water declarations as well, just finding ways to lift those up. And maybe it's building relationships with Indigenous, like local Indigenous folks, if that hasn't already happened. And then two is, like, what are the spaces in which we can respect and implement those laws? And that might be in, like, schools, or that might be in like communities, and maybe having like a community declaration, like a settler community declaration could be helpful too. So I'll leave it there.
Emma, thank you for that. Thank you very much. And I can't help but think, with the disclosures of residential school abuse and the stories that came out last June, it's really in Canadian consciousness a lot more of actually our relationship with the oppressive regime against different Indigenous groups all across the country. And I wonder if that cannot be a button to connect to water. I just noticed in more mainstream spaces that I work in, people are more advocating for water rights, and there's more of an awareness there. Brian in the chat is sharing and reminding us how we do have an Ontario election coming up June 2nd. So there's more of that vulnerability there, where the government will want, there's more of a discussion space to say what our demands are in government. So thanks for pointing that out, Brian. Joanna, on to the next question.
Yes, indeed. So is there a roadmap of sorts to protect our rivers?
Is there a roadmap of sorts to protect our rivers? It's a beautiful question. We really need maps, right? We need to take the time to reflect and come together. And I don't have an immediate answer to that, but I just look at the rights of nature movement, and I think for reasons of Canada's need to decolonize and what's before us with our relationship with Indigenous folks, and also what's facing us with water, I feel like the rights of nature movement is a great platform, because it's not just a legal standing. It allows us to do things like build a Bill of Rights for the Thames River or the Great Lakes watershed, and those things are happening. Does anybody want to speak more directly to that, Pat or Emma?
Yeah, sure. If you'd like, I guess it's interesting. Marilyn's comment. She's wondering about the Grand River. I'll just bring it back to the London example and the Thames River. The Grand River has the Grand River Conservation Authority, which is one body that deals with the entire watershed of the Grand River. Conservation authorities have historically had a fairly significant role in the management of rivers. In the London example, we've got the Thames River, which is 217 kilometers long, if I remember my facts straight. And in London, we've got 43 kilometers of that river. So we have a fairly significant part to play, but we're not the only person involved. We have quite an area upstream of us, all the way up to Stratford and Woodstock, and a large area downstream of us. And we're the only watershed in the Ontario that has two conservation authorities dealing with the same river. So we have the Upper Thames River Conservation Authority and the Lower Thames Valley Conservation Authority. So an interesting aspect there. We also have a number of First Nations in the Lower Thames portion of the watershed, being the ones right along the river, being Chippewa, the Thames, Oneida, and Munsee. And so we have a number of different partners, I'll call them, in managing the watershed of the Thames River. And going back to the slide that Jennifer had on the Thames River Clearwater Revival, that is a very unusual collection of partners, just because we have not had a management plan, I'll call it, in quotes, for the Thames River since 1975. That was the one and only management plan that dealt with the entire river. And when I was involved in the origins of the Clearwater Revival, when we were trying to convince people that this is a good thing, because 1975 was quite a while ago, I used to reflect that in 1975, gasoline was 42 cents a liter. We had the other Trudeau as our federal prime minister. And I think the most popular movie was, what was it, Jaws and Towering Inferno, if I'm not mistaken. So it was a long time ago. This initiative called the Clearwater Revival is basically rewriting a watershed plan. And the interesting aspect is when we had the engagement of our First Nations, and we had that very early in the discussion, the first thing they said to us is, we don't manage water. Water is not a resource. Water is life. So we changed the document that is being prepared, and it's basically called a shared waters approach. And that is a fairly minor but very significant thing, depending on how you look at it. And it was very much a change in the thought process, which we found was very, very significant, just in the way that we discuss the Thames River. And from the First Nations perspective came that idea that they were actually recommending that we do give rights to the river. So that is a concept locally. And to come back to the original question, I think you'll find that conservation authorities, because they are laid out on a watershed basis, they have the best roadmap, assuming that there's a provincial government that supports them. And again, we come back to the election. You may want to question whether the government of the day is actually supporting conservation authorities as much as they need to. There is some discussion about changing the Conservation Authorities Act, and there's some proposals in there. So again, not trying to put the activism hat on because I'm a municipal employee, I have to watch what I say, but definitely there is an opportunity for strengthening the roadmaps that do exist and making sure that they're as solid as we possibly can.
Thank you so much for that. And I see Marilyn's responded saying that that was very helpful. So thank you. I'm aware of the time. It's already 2:25. Joanna, I think there was a last question. Maybe we can touch on that briefly before we go into closing and final announcements.
Yeah, I mean, there's been some good interaction with people responding. The only outstanding question I'm seeing right now that hasn't been discussed in the chat is the role of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities here in advocating for these policy directions across municipalities. So that's the FCM.
Yeah. Is there somebody that wants to take that question? My only experience with the FCM is working with someone who sat on that committee around trade agreements and trying to push more of a critical lens with that. So I don't have a response to that.
I can speak briefly about it in that I think it can be a helpful space to bring this up. Like I think about the Blue Communities project, and when we were working on those, we had a resolution passed there about the Blue Communities, so it can help spread the word about it. I don't know how much, I don't think the resolutions are directive, but it can definitely influence or even give ideas to municipalities who might not necessarily know about the rights of nature or these ideas.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Emma. It's 2:26, so I think we're in wrap up mode. Joanna, am I correct in understanding that folks can send questions through the library and get a response? Like, can you just explain that in terms of these sessions?
Absolutely, yeah. So people can submit questions at any time through our Environmentalist webpage. So I'll include that in the chat now. But other than that, I will just turn it back to you to offer some areas where people can take action and connect.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, so just maybe considering, and I see that idea kind of being generated already in the chat. Julie put forward like promoting specific legislation for rights of nature in terms of water, but like what are some other thoughts on actions if this movement moves us? What are some actions that are possible? One thought that I bring is just from the perspective of there's many layers to work on these issues. Pat was highlighting, you know, our shifts in thinking, our shifts in consciousness. Yeah, so there's maybe many things in our daily life we can do that honors the planet as a living community and not property. So there's a lot of space we can work with that. Maybe you have some thoughts on that. Please feel welcome to put them in the chat, how we can do that in our daily life. But in terms of learning more about these issues, there are a number of resources that we can access. But before we get there, you know, I think the major teaching out of the rights of nature work, for me anyway, as a settler, is to look for more ways to really uplift Indigenous communities and what they're already doing, and to find connections to collaborate. So, you know, with our local Indigenous communities. In terms of resources for learning and just getting involved, GARN, Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, has a lot of resources, and they offer webinars. You can go to their Rights of Nature tribunals. These are like great events in the past. They've been hosted by Tom Goldtooth, Vandana Shiva, different folks. You can just register on their website for free, but they also have a lot of resources there. And then of course the Council of Canadians. I know Maud Barlow was really like such the champion, and she is one of the champions in Canada of the rights of nature, but I think the council is still involved, working and discussing that. There's certainly a lot of knowledge there, as we can see from some people from Council of Canadians here today. And of course we have a London chapter. Books, this presentation was based on, you know, the book on the left, and in the center, there's a lot of great books out there. And these are also posted on the library website as well under Environmentalist in Residence. There's a couple of declarations. If you want to add your voice, a drop in the water in the building an ocean, to pass the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Mother Earth through the UN. There's a petition. You can just power the movement with the rights of rivers petition that's growing as well. And I think we'll let Arundhati Roy have the last words. Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. I take heart in knowing that you are all out there with your hearts and minds doing critical work and making shifts. And I remember in this moment that we are not alone, but we are part of civil society, and we are part of a great turning, whether or not we see that all the time. It's there. Closing announcements, I have two. The first announcement is that a great group of folks, and their logos are at the bottom there, have organized for our city an Earth Fest. As people who care about our planetary home and nature community locally, it's great to come together and celebrate. And I hear they're doing all sorts of great stuff on that day, like chalk murals, face painting, there'll be food trucks and music. It's nice to have a good time together and make connections, but also they'll be sharing some critical information. There'll be a climate march as well. So everybody is invited and welcome to promote that event, please, for them. And last but not least, if you liked today's session, you liked these themes, some of the themes presented here, just touched upon, will be addressed in future sessions of the Environmentalist in Residence series. The next one is on April 14th. This one is also on Zoom, and I'll just be sharing some research, what I found from looking at the research on what to do with eco-anxiety and eco-grief and how important that is to move it into action. I'll be sharing some literature from climate therapists and other folks. The Council of Canadians London chapter will be here with Nora and Lynn to share about local actions you can take through the Council. The London Environmental Network will also be here, which is a great hub that really helps people link to any of the issues that we care about. They're the connectors on that, linking us to local organizations in the City of London. We'll also be back sharing some city information on what we can do with our actual like home around climate and different things. So, okay, I want to give thanks from my end for your presence today. Thanks for this opportunity from the library and the city. Thank you very much to Emma and to Pat and to Joanna. And I believe, Joanna, you're going to say the last words.
Well, I just wanted to thank all of you for your time and energy. Jennifer, Emma, Pat, it's been extremely informative, and we'll just make sure to monitor the chat for anything that we need to follow up on. I will follow up on people on prizes. But other than that, I've shared in the link the Environmentalist webpage for you to look at these events for registration or to email me directly. And that is it. Thank you so much to everyone. I'll just bring Emma back here as well as Pat to just give a wave. But yeah, thank you so much for your time. And thanks for joining us. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,